The United States of America has announced a new phase of war with Iran and called it the economic phase of the war. In particular, they are now threatening to exert maximum sanctions pressure on Iran to put pressure on all its proxy forces. And what's very important, to pressure all of Iran's partners and allies with sanctions, who in one way or another will try to cooperate with the regime in Tehran. And now Vice President J.D. Vance stated today that supposedly the US is in a phase where, quote, we will be able not only to confidently state that their nuclear facilities have been destroyed, but also to assert with certainty that they will never try to restore them. Well, now the US Treasury has announced that they have once again added Hezbollah to the sanctions list for activities in the interest of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. At the same time, there was a report that the US approved the sale of tanker aircraft to Qatar for a rather substantial amount. This is part of that too, strengthening an adversary in the region. And in addition, most importantly, this is happening on the eve of Chinese leader Xi Jinping's visit to the United States of America, give or take. A month later, the US called on China to join the program to isolate Iran's economy and bring down its government. Iran. So in fact, they decided to actually bring about the capitulation and downfall of the Iranian regime. Interestingly, the Russians didn't like this news. They're already shouting that this is a violation, that you can't do this, and so on. They say that Washington wants to achieve supposedly illegal goals, and that it's chosen the wrong path altogether. And at the same time, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is trying to explain to the oil market that, in fact, their strategy is actually a winning one. And there's no need to fear that some kind of escalation will occur. So, let's go over the latest updates together regarding Donald Trump's economic war against Iran, what's included and what are they trying to do now. To the regime in Tehran, moving from the active combat phase of the war, that is, when missiles and shells are flying, to economic strangulation and economic isolation. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, please subscribe to the channel, click the bell and don't forget to like. So recently, Donald Trump announced the start of an economic war and the unprecedented isolation of Iran. Trump warned that countries whose financial institutions, companies or government bodies support Iran will face serious economic consequences. Next, I will give the full verbatim quote from Donald Trump. No one has given the Islamic Republic of Iran more opportunities to make a deal than I have. Tragically for them, they are impossible. Today, I am announcing the most devastating economic operation ever carried out against any country. This will be an economic war and isolation on an unprecedented scale. Their fleet has been destroyed, their air force crushed, their military factories now lie in ruins, their currency is worthless, and their country is hanging by a thread. Today, I am also announcing that any country that allows its financial institutions, businesses, airports or government agencies to provide any form of assistance to Iran will itself face enormous economic consequences. Oil smuggling, swap lines, cash transfers, exchanges, exchange offices, ship registrations, shell companies. All of this must stop now. You know who you are. This will be an economic D-Day. And we need all our allies to stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States of America to isolate and defeat the Iranian threat. These maniacs are on their last legs, and these historic measures will paralyze them and their ability to spread terror around the world. Iran will never get nuclear weapons. Well, in response to such a statement by Donald Trump, the Iranians have already reacted. In particular, the head of the Iranian parliament's National Security Committee, Ebrahim Azizi, called on the US to immediately stop sponsoring, withdraw its presence from the Middle East and accept Iran's new regional order. Here is his quote. "We are watching your every move. Any further mistake or miscalculation will have consequences that will be much more serious than before. Immediately end your presence in the region before it is too late and accept the new regional order established by Iran. Well, obviously the Iranians will keep blustering, and looking ahead, I'll say right away that the Iranians definitely won't let Donald Trump simply freeze the war and move on to an economic blockade. No, of course, they will continue, as much as they can, to carry out missile strikes and drone attacks, while Trump moves on to economic strangulation. So this absolutely does not mean that if the Americans have moved on to economic strangulation, the Iranians will also agree to stop the fighting. Right, so it's clear that this will continue, and Iran has already made that clear. In addition, the Iranian Foreign Ministry issued a statement calling Trump's announced devastating economic operation aimed at isolating Iran an act of terrorism and a crime against humanity. Next, I will quote the Iranian Foreign Ministry. The US economic sanctions against Iran, targeting the fundamental rights of every Iranian citizen, are an act of economic terrorism and a crime against humanity. And those who order the imposition of these sanctions and carry them out for committing such heinous crimes must be brought to justice and held accountable. Sanctions and economic pressure are just the other side of the same coin as military aggression. The United States' unhealthy reliance on these two tools not only creates a real threat to international peace and security, but has also brought human civilization to an unprecedented moral decline. The United States' conspicuous announcement of new sanctions is a continuation of a policy that has already been tried and has failed. The Islamic Republic of Iran will use all available means and resources to counter the hostile actions of the American Zionist adversary and to protect its national interests. Iran. Well, yes, this is quite strong rhetoric, but as you can see, they haven't mentioned any specifics yet, although there have already been some leaks. They have made it clear that they will definitely continue their attacks on American bases in the region and are already threatening attacks on American bases in Eastern Europe. And then Scott Bessent, the US Secretary of the Treasury, finally started to give some specifics about what is meant and what will actually happen. Q. What is this economic pressure and what is this historically unprecedented economic isolation, as Bessent put it? Bessent stated that the new US policy towards Iran, which involves maximum economic pressure, makes a large-scale war less likely. Bol, this is exactly a transition from the military phase to the economic one. The head of the US Treasury stated that the global oil markets, which have been showing growth for several weeks, are misinterpreting Washington's new policy towards Tehran. I'd add that Scott Bessent, honestly, no one understands your policy, if we're being truthful. Well, Trump was shouting about epic fury, and now that epic fury is over, without ever achieving its goal. Not a single objective set at the beginning of the war on February 28, 2026 was accomplished. 6 months have passed, and Trump says, well, now we're moving from the military component to the economic one. And Besson says, I think the oil markets misunderstand what this economic pressure really means. We have asymmetric information, and I'm not sure why oil prices spike because of this. If we're applying maximum economic pressure, that means there probably won't be a large-scale resumption of hostilities. It's very strange to hear this from the finance minister of a country like the United States of America, when he says, I don't quite understand why oil prices are rising. What's happening? He says. Why are oil prices going up? Once again, you see, Scott Besson is absolutely sure that if the US switches to the economic aspect of the war, then everyone else will do the same. That's strange logic. I mean, no one is forbidding Iran, or rather, no one will stop Iran from continuing its strikes. Will Iran continue to shell ships in the Hormuz Strait? Yes, it will. Will it try to attack American bases in the region? Yes, it will. And then it will escalate the situation. That doesn't mean that if the US says, we're moving to the economic aspect, Iran will just say, damn, okay, then we won't launch missiles either. Then we'll say, fine, that's it, no missiles, no drones, nothing will fly, just because the Americans have moved to another phase. And so, Besson, well, there won't be a big war. Once again, this doesn't mean that the Iranians will stop. Nevertheless, it's interesting that the Russians have already responded to this new method or new US strategy. And today, the Russian ambassador to Iran, Mikhail Ulyanov, criticized Donald Trump's statement in which he threatened Tehran with an economic war and isolation of unprecedented scale. So, the Russian diplomat stated that if Washington wants to achieve some of its goals, it has chosen the wrong path by threatening Iran. He said, "Listen, honest diplomacy is needed." Next, excuse me, but I'll quote that Russian, Mikhail Ulyanov. Iran has been under US sanctions for decades. Tehran demonstrated its ability to withstand maximum pressure during Trump's first presidential term. If Washington wants to achieve some of its goals, it has chosen the wrong path. Positive results are possible only through honest diplomacy. The sooner the US understands this, the better. And then, as we already discussed in one of the previous episodes, as part of this economic pressure, Washington could impose sanctions on Chinese oil refineries that buy Iranian oil and against Chinese banks that handle payments for this very Iranian oil. This would hit Tehran very hard and be very painful. And here is Scott Bessent, the very same US Secretary of the Treasury, stated that Washington does not rule it out. Beijing, that is China, is among the countries being asked to support Donald Trump's new campaign to isolate the Iranian economy. And, as he put it, toppling the government in Tehran. Bessent emphasized that Washington expects both allies and rivals to join the intensified campaign against Iran. When asked whether Washington is putting pressure on China, Bessent stated that, quote, "Many conversations are better held privately, but urged Beijing to join the program. In short, it is still unknown, and most likely, no sanctions will be imposed before Xi Jinping's visit to Washington." And against this backdrop, the US has finally started to impose certain sanctions. As part of this apparent economic pressure, the US Treasury has once again added Hezbollah to the sanctions list for activities in the interest of the IRGC Quds Force of Iran. The sanctions list also included 10 individuals who are part of a network responsible for transferring funds to Hezbollah. And in the US Treasury statement, it is said that the network uses couriers traveling on commercial flights. On flights between Lebanon, Turkey, the Emirates and Iran to move up to hundreds of millions of dollars between different jurisdictions. This, as stated by the Treasury, allows Hezbollah to obtain foreign currency outside the official financial system and bypass sanctions. And then the Treasury statement goes on to say, Hezbollah has been relisted under Executive Order number 13,224, as amended, for being owned, controlled or directed by the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or for acting or allegedly acting for or on behalf of the IRGC Quds Force. And finally, I'll add the statement from J.D. Vance, who was supposedly supposed to outline for us what this new phase of economic warfare is all about. And so J.D. Vance stated that yes, a new phase of the war with Iran has begun, which consists of exerting economic pressure on Tehran. Quote, "We destroyed their conventional armed forces. We put enormous pressure on their industrial base where they used to produce weapons. And now, in a certain sense, we are entering a new phase where the most effective tool that we have is the economic pressure that we can exert on them. And it's a delicate balance, because by putting economic pressure on them, we will face attempts from their side to put economic pressure on us. But over the past couple of weeks, it has been obvious that they have been under much more pressure than we have. And we will continue in the same way, because we believe that this is the best way to ultimately achieve the final goal here. I strongly urge supporters of Donald Trump to remember this quote from J.D. Vance. The Vice President of the United States clearly says that this is the best tool for forcing Iran to make peace out of all the available options. And here a question arises. If this is the best tool, namely economic pressure, why was this half a year of war necessary? What was the point? Let me remind you, before the war that started on February 28, the US was already applying maximum economic pressure, as Donald Trump put it. And if this maximum economic pressure is the best tool to achieve the goal, the question is, why the hell was half a year of war necessary? Can we interpret J.D. Vance's statement as essentially an admission that, well, they messed up? The whole team of Donald Trump messed up? And finally, I'll add one more phrase from J.D. Vance. He says the following, quote, "We are at that phase of the war with Iran where we can not only confidently state that their nuclear facilities have been destroyed, but also assert with certainty that they will never attempt to restore them. In short, as they say, we kept swimming and drowned right before reaching the shore." I'll leave it at that. These are all the updates on the new phase of the US war against Iran. Share your thoughts on these statements in the comments. My view on this is that the US had already started an economic war before this active phase of the war, which lasted for 6 months. They exerted the maximum possible economic pressure. When this economic pressure didn't work, Donald Trump moved on to a military campaign, a massive campaign of strikes against Iran. When this strategy of military pressure didn't work, Trump returned to economic pressure, and now J.D. Vance says with a straight face that this is the best tool we have to achieve our goal. So we finally come to this. Now we're definitely going to strangle Iran economically. Something tells me they won't succeed. But I'll leave it at that. Write your comments, subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all. Take care of yourselves. Bye everyone.